Ukraine has launched a series of strikes hitting major ships within Russia's Black Sea fleet. Just what sort of effects will this have on the front lines? And is Russia responding with some serious weaponry of their own? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So this is kind of the biggest story. Ukraine is reporting that it hit 2 Russian landing ships off the coast of occupied Crimea. And you guys know that this has been a recurrent theme for the Ukrainian armed forces, where they target the relatively vulnerable Russian Black Sea fleet. And despite a host of changes to how the Black Sea fleet operates, they are still basically unable to stop Ukrainian weapons. And this is a larger commentary, I think, on how antiquated the entire globe's naval forces are. Naval forces really only able to achieve any meaningful effects if they can support ground forces, right? Like, nobody cares if you can float your cruiser in the middle of the Indian Ocean. You have to be near where human beings are. But Ukraine has found that even though Russia has one of the most advanced navies in the world with multiple nuclear-powered ships and multiple aircraft carriers, it still isn't really that effective at doing, well, much of anything. The Ukrainian Defense Forces hit the Azov and Yamal large landing ships. They also struck a communication center and infrastructure facilities of the Black Sea Fleet within Crimea. Now, the military didn't say how, but a Moscow official in the region said that it was a air-based attack, which is interesting because we've also seen these ships targeted by Ukrainian naval drones. Russian air defenses shot down more than 10 missiles, but it's not clear on how many missiles weren't shot down, right? That's always a favorite of when you have Russian forces telling you what they did shoot down, but obviously 10 was not enough based on the fact that 2 other vessels were sunk. And what's interesting is that even the Russian-appointed governor of Sevastopol described it as, quote, the most massive attack in recent times. Now, what's pretty interesting to me is that supposedly this was done using Storm Shadow missiles. Let's see if we can find some of the data here. Institute for the Study of War, of course, has a more in-depth coverage of this instance, but it seems like this was likely done using Storm Shadow missiles as well as drones. Here we go. 40 Storm Shadow and Neptune missiles. Remember, Storm Shadows provided by the UK, but Neptunes are actually, I believe, designed and constructed within Ukraine, right? Custom built to operate within this Crimean peninsula. And here's what's also interesting. ADM-160 decoy missiles. This is something we haven't seen before. And we've noticed that over the course of this war that a lot of these air attacks simply expect a certain level of attrition, and that they involve, whether it's Russia or Ukraine, sending a mass quantity of drones and aircraft into the battle space, and then expecting a certain percentage of them to get taken out by air defenses, but a certain percentage penetrate. And the fact that Ukraine has evolved enough to actually deliberately deploy decoy missiles and decoy drones is a really interesting sign that tactics are evolving, right? We're looking more and more at this drone swarm type of technology, right? Or type of tactics. And the fact that you're partnering live missiles with decoys is really, really fascinating, and a really, really fascinating way to thwart air defenses. And again, this seems to have been highly effective, given that, again, the Black Sea Fleet lost a communications satellite or a communications center, as well as 2 major landing ships. There's also been some footage purportedly of an explosion at an oil depot near Sevastopol. So a real sign that deep strike tactics in this war are evolving tremendously. But it's not just Ukraine that's launching these strikes, right? Russia also has been stepping up their tactics. According to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Russia in the last 24 hours has deployed hypersonic missiles and actually used them to hit Kiev. Now, you may be like, hypersonic missiles just sound like some kind of branding, right? Like someone that, you can buy an iPhone 5 or you can buy a hypersonic iPhone 5, right? But this is actually a distinct weapon system. It's a weapon capable of traveling at hypersonic speed between Mach 5 and Mach 25, or about 1 to 1.5 miles per second. Right below such speeds, they would be characterized as supersonic. Below that, subsonic. Right? But the fact that what makes them so worrisome and dangerous, right? You can see a lot of countries have rolled these out, but what makes them so dangerous is that they just move too fast for a lot of air defenses, right? The United States claims the Patriot missile can be used against hypersonic missiles like this, but it is really, really tough. And the fact that the U.S. had to produce a next generation interceptor and something called the Enhanced Hypersonic Missile Defense System tells me that there's something about the Patriot missile batteries that are inadequate to stop this threat, right? If it was sufficient, then they would just make more Patriots. So you see this, and it's a sign, I think, that one, Russian sanctions are not really having the same effects that people thought, right? We're years into this war, and there was a lot of prognostication that Russia would run out of its arsenal of deep strike weapons, of cruise missiles, etc. But it seems like they really haven't, that their pace has slowed somewhat, but they have not stopped. And the longer sanctions are in place, the easier it is for someone like Russia to evade them. Think of sanctions as a little bit like a dam, right? You can dam a river for a while, but unless you really, 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 really carefully construct those dams, the water's going to find a way around it. Or if you prefer, think of it like building a sandcastle on the beach. Maybe you can block it for a little bit, but sooner or later, that water's going to find its way through nooks, crannies, crevices, and eventually it's going to be able to flow almost unobstructed where it wants. And that's kind of how these sanctions seem to have worked out, where the Russian economy is growing, right? They're able to produce sophisticated weapon systems. It's not clear that sanctions alone have disabled the Russian defense industrial base as the West might have hoped. Now, if you need a little bit, I can't give you hypersonic abilities. You won't run at 25 times the speed of sound, but if you need a little bit of a boost of energy to make it through the day, you might want some Strike Gum. Strike Gum, of course, designed from my time in Afghanistan when I needed to drink gross pre-workouts or gross energy drinks before going on patrol because I needed that hit of caffeine. Well, Strike Gum is just better in every way, right? Zero sugar. Each one of these pieces has as much caffeine as a Red Bull or an Amp Energy, right? And one pack has 5 of them. And if you get a tray, it works out to like 60 cents a piece. It's really, really, really efficient and really, really, really affordable compared to a $4 Red Bull. You want to check it out at strikegum.com, but even better, we're on Amazon now. So you can go to Amazon, you can look for Strike Gum Energy or Strike Gum. You'll see it. You can't miss it. I'm also going to link it in the descriptions if you're interested. So we've always got discounts going on. We've even got new customer discounts, veteran and military discounts. So check us out. Okay. So here's the other thing I wanted to talk about, which I thought was really interesting. First off, you may have noticed I haven't said much about the front lines. And while there's been some minor updates, the truth is that Russia is just nowhere near resuming anything resembling offense. When what Ukraine seems to be doing is under Syrskyi is much more willing to trade space for time. There's a lot of fears that Syrskyi would be a dig in and fight at all cost guy. He has proven that he isn't. He's willing to yield. He's willing to yield bad terrain to the Russians in order to force them to fight in terrain that favors Ukraine. And there's no better illustration of this than this Berdichi-Orlivka-Tonenke line. And you can see, as I talked about weeks and weeks ago, this river has formed the backbone of the Ukrainian defenses outside Avdiivka. Right? You can see that Russian forces still stuck inside Orlivka, still trying to roll Ukrainians in Berdichi, but basically they are unable to cross this river here. And until they're able to do so, the Russian forces are just going to get ground down by Ukrainians, because you can even see here that everything to the west, the Ukrainian-controlled side, is at elevation. So Ukrainians are literally sitting on the top of a hill, looking down on these Russians who have to conduct a river crossing in order to get to the Ukrainians. It's kind of one-sided, right? And this is where you want this fight to happen. And I think we're seeing something similar outside of Chasiv Yar, again, where supposedly, while the Ukrainians have yielded some pretty low-value territory to the Russians near Bodaniv and Kronomova, they are really digging hard into Chasiv Yar and basically daring the Russians to try to fight them here. But here's what I thought was actually an even more sort of interesting meta commentary. And that is this chart here coming to us from Reddit. This is a Reddit user. Let me see. I can't quite find who it is. I'll let you guys know. But here's the chart. The chart is a map of Ukraine aid as a percentage of GDP, but including EU contributions, right? Because remember, the EU itself is also writing checks to the Ukrainians, and the EU does not contribute funds equally, right? Wealthier countries generally provide more funds to the EU, and they can leverage that to produce even greater influence within the country. So when you roll up EU aid, you find some really interesting statistics. First off, that the Nordics, who view Russia as probably the most credible threat, are spending an insane amount of GDP on this. And you could see, look, like some of these like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're spending 4% of their GDP. Guys, the entire U.S. defense budget, right? People are like, oh, the U.S. spends so much money on military stuff. We spend 3% of our GDP on military affairs. So these guys are spending 4% just to bankroll Ukraine, not even counting their own military, right? You've got almost 2% here with, I think that's Sweden, or Norway, right? So you see that a lot of these Nordics are spending a lot of money to destroy Russians, right? Here's the Netherlands spending almost 3% of its GDP just to support Ukraine against Russia. And they don't even share a border, right? And now, of course, then you also have Poland, right, who has been a staunch supporter, 1.3% of its GDP, right? So that's probably about half of its budget. Poland is one of the only other countries that spend 3% of its GDP, but because it's literally NATO's front line, it feels obligated to. And having worked briefly with the Polish military, they are quite good. But you can see you also have Germany, right? And what's most interesting to me is that for the United States, right, we have contributed only 0.25% of our GDP. Remember, these commas are done in the European style. So 0.25% of our GDP literally is offsetting basically the entire European contribution. And that to me is sort of incredible. That the United States, again, the size of our economy, absolutely preposterous. And our ability to, with, about 5% of our defense budget and 0.25% of our GDP, we can basically bankroll the Ukrainians to hold the Russians at bay single-handedly. And it's hard to overstate this, that we expend so little of our GDP in order to stop one of the largest and most powerful militaries on the globe, and it's not even being done by U.S. forces. This is what I tell people when I say that Ukraine is an absolute steal. To cripple one of the militaries of a huge geopolitical rival, and it is a trivial amount of effort. Like, to give you an idea of how little that is, right? The average American, let's say the average American household makes about $50,000 a year, right? So to get that number, right, we're talking about 0.0028. I think that's about right. That's the equivalent. We're spending the equivalent of about $140 is what you and I would spend a year in order to single-handedly stop the Russian army in its tracks, right? So again, this is why there's a lot of hand wringing, because the US government's numbers are really big. But when you scale them down to the budget of an average American, you see that this is not even the US's version of a car payment. All right. So anyway, guys, that's all I had. Of course, thank you to the Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com. I appreciate your support. You guys enable me to do this. You know, I've had a bizarre number of videos recently get demonetized. Really weird. I think it's because it's an election year and YouTube is cracking down on small creators who promote disinformation. Which is funny, because if you're a fan of this channel, you know that countering disinformation is like a core aspect of what we do here. But thank you guys for your support. You guys enable me to do this, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.